August 1944, prisoner of war camp Saipan. The evening meal was being served. Private First Class Yoshiro Tanaka stood in line with his metal tray, watching the American cook scoop food onto each prisoner's plate. Rice, some kind of vegetable, and then the cook reached into a third container and added a portion of brown chunks in gravy. Meat. Tanaka stared at it as he moved toward the tables. This was his fourth day in the camp, fourth meal, and this was the third time meat had appeared on his tray. 3 times in 4 meals. Something was wrong. He sat down across from Private Kenji Yamada, who'd been captured the same day. Yamada was already eating, but slowly, cautiously, like he expected the food to turn poisonous. Tanaka whispered that this was the 3rd time they'd received meat. Yamada nodded, his face troubled. He'd counted 2. He suggested maybe it was a mistake, that the Americans had accidentally given them officer rations, that surely someone would notice and correct it soon. Tanaka considered this. It made sense. In the Imperial Army, meat was reserved for officers. Enlisted men almost never received it, so perhaps the American cooks had confused prisoner rations with officer rations. The mistake would be discovered. Tomorrow they'd go back to normal food, but tomorrow came, and meat appeared again at lunch. Not a large portion, but present. Visible. Undeniable. 5th meal. 4th time. Tanaka began to feel uneasy. This wasn't a mistake. Mistakes don't repeat 4 times. This was intentional. Systematic. The Americans were deliberately giving prisoners meat multiple times daily. Why? What was the purpose? What were they trying to prove? Over the next week, the pattern continued. 2 meals daily. At least 1, usually both, included meat. Sometimes beef, sometimes pork, sometimes something the other prisoners said was called spam, a canned meat product. But always, consistently, meat. Tanaka found himself growing suspicious. This had to be propaganda, a deliberate demonstration designed to demoralize Japanese prisoners. Look how much food we have. Look how we can waste meat on enemy prisoners. Look how abundant our resources are. It was working. Because Tanaka had served 3 years in the Imperial Army and had eaten meat perhaps 15 times total. But in 2 weeks as an American prisoner, he'd eaten meat 20 times. The mathematics didn't make sense. It couldn't be sustainable. Eventually, the meat would run out. Eventually, they'd revert to normal rations, rice and vegetables, the way military forces actually ate. Private Yamada had a different theory. He suggested that perhaps the Americans were fattening them up for some purpose. Medical experiments maybe, or they needed healthy prisoners for heavy labor. So they fed them well temporarily. Then once prisoners recovered their strength, the good food would stop. This seemed more logical than simple abundance. Tanaka accepted this explanation and stopped questioning the meat. Just ate it. Waited for the inevitable change back to normal rations. But weeks passed. The meat continued. Morning and evening. Beef, pork, chicken appeared once. Always cooked properly, never spoiled, always adequate portions. 1 month into captivity, something happened that shattered Tanaka's theories completely. He'd been assigned to work detail in the camp kitchen, helping with meal preparation. Basic work, washing dishes, moving supplies, cleaning surfaces. The American cook supervised but didn't seem worried about prisoners seeing their operations, which is how Tanaka ended up in the storage area. The kitchen supervisor had sent him to retrieve a box of canned vegetables. He walked into the storage room and stopped. The room was large. Very large, and along one entire wall were shelves, industrial shelving units. And on those shelves were cans. Hundreds of cans, maybe thousands, all labeled, all organized by type. Tanaka moved closer. Read the labels. Beef, pork, chicken, ham. More varieties of canned meat than he'd known existed. Stack after stack after stack, each stack containing dozens of cans. He started counting. Lost track after 300 cans of beef alone. And that was just one section of one shelf. There were 6 shelves, each 6 meters long, each packed with canned meat. His mind tried to calculate. If each can served maybe 8 people, 1 meal, and there were thousands of cans, that meant he couldn't finish the math. The numbers were too large, too impossible. But the implications were clear. The Americans weren't running a propaganda operation. They weren't temporarily feeding prisoners well. They had enough meat to feed the camp for months, maybe years. The meat wasn't scarce. It was abundant, standard, normal. The kitchen supervisor found him standing there staring at the shelves. The supervisor asked through an interpreter if Tanaka was all right. Tanaka asked about the meat, how much they had, how long it would last. The supervisor looked confused by the question. He explained this was standard supply. They received shipments every 2 weeks, restocked before running low, always maintained sufficient inventory for projected needs, plus 20% buffer. Tanaka asked what happened if the supply ship stopped coming. The supervisor said they wouldn't stop coming. The logistics network was reliable, but even if it did stop, they had enough supplies for about 6 weeks. Then emergency reserves would activate. Alternate supply routes, the system had redundancy built in. Redundancy, backup plans, 6 weeks of buffer supplies, the casual certainty that food would always be available. Tanaka thanked him and returned to his work, but his hands were shaking. That night he told Yamada what he'd seen. The storage room, the thousands of cans, the systematic abundance. Yamada asked if Tanaka was certain he'd counted correctly. Tanaka confirmed he was certain. He'd seen it, shelf after shelf. Enough meat to feed everyone in the camp for months. They sat in silence. What was there to say? In the Japanese army, a storage room with that much meat would be a strategic resource, guarded, rationed carefully, reserved for crisis situations or officer consumption. But here it was just routine storage, normal inventory, standard supply levels. The difference was categorical. Over the following weeks, Tanaka paid attention to other details he'd previously ignored. The American guards ate the same food as prisoners. Same meat, same portions. Which meant this wasn't special prisoner rations. This was just normal American military food. He watched supply trucks arrive weekly. Massive trucks carrying crates and crates of provisions. Meat, vegetables, coffee, sugar, everything in quantities that seemed excessive. But apparently those quantities were normal, expected, planned. He overheard American soldiers complaining about the food once, calling it bland, boring, standard issue garbage, complaining about having beef stew again when they were tired of beef stew, complaining about having too much of the same meat, not enough variety in their meat options. Tanaka wanted to laugh, or cry, or something. Japanese soldiers had prayed for any meat. American soldiers complained about which type of meat they were tired of eating. 3 months into captivity, the camp doctor performed routine medical examinations on all prisoners. Tanaka stood on a scale while the doctor recorded his weight. The doctor noted that Tanaka weighed 68 kilograms. 3 months ago at intake, he'd weighed 52 kilograms. He'd gained 16 kilograms in 3 months. Tanaka stared at the scale. 16 kilograms, more than 30 pounds. His body had been starving and he hadn't fully realized it. Chronic malnutrition had seemed normal because everyone in the Japanese army was malnourished. But now, with adequate food, his body was recovering, rebuilding, returning to what a healthy adult male should weigh. The doctor explained through an interpreter that Tanaka's recovery was typical. Most prisoners gained significant weight in their first 3 months. The human body responds quickly to adequate nutrition after prolonged deprivation. Muscle rebuilds, fat stores restore, organ function improves. Given proper food, the body heals itself. Tanaka asked how this was possible, how they had enough food to restore health to hundreds of prisoners while Japan couldn't feed its own soldiers adequately. The doctor gave a simple answer: industrial agriculture. America's farming operations were mechanized. Tractors, harvesters, irrigation systems, chemical fertilizers, scientific breeding programs. all of it designed to maximize food production. Combined with refrigerated transportation and preservation technology, they could produce and distribute food at scales traditional agriculture couldn't match. The doctor continued. American food production in 1943 was approximately 350 million tons, enough to feed their entire population, their entire military, allied forces through Lend-Lease, and still maintained strategic reserves. Food wasn't scarce, it was abundant. The challenge wasn't producing enough, it was efficiently distributing what they produced. Japan's production that same year had been roughly 50 million tons, 7 times less than America, for a population that wasn't 7 times smaller. Which meant per capita, Japanese citizens and soldiers were receiving far less food than American citizens and soldiers. Malnutrition wasn't an accident or bad planning, it was mathematical inevitability. The doctor said something else that stayed with Tanaka. Proper nutrition is the foundation of military effectiveness. Malnourished soldiers can't fight effectively, can't march long distances, can't recover from wounds, can't resist disease. Feeding soldiers adequately isn't humanitarian, it's strategic. Every calorie invested in soldier nutrition returns as combat capability. America understood this, planned for it, executed logistics to ensure it happened. Japan apparently had not. Tanaka returned to his barracks thinking about numbers. 350 million tons versus 50 million. 16 kilograms gained in 3 months. Thousands of cans of meat in storage. All the mathematics of abundance versus scarcity. In October 1944, something happened that crystallized everything. A cargo ship arrived at the island carrying supplies. Tanaka's work detail was assigned to unloading duty at the dock. He spent 6 hours moving crates from ship to warehouse. During a water break, he stood on the dock and watched the operation. The cargo ship was large, very large, and it was being unloaded by multiple work details simultaneously. Crates coming off in continuous flow, forklifts moving, trucks hauling. The whole operation coordinated with mechanical efficiency. Tanaka asked the American supervisor how much food was on the ship. The supervisor consulted a manifest. This ship carried approximately 800 tons of provisions, mixed cargo, about 60% food supplies. Rest was equipment and ammunition, so roughly 480 tons of food. Tanaka did mental math. 480 tons. That was 480,000 kilograms. If the average person ate maybe 2 kilograms of food daily, that meant this one ship carried enough food for 240,000 person days of rations. Enough to feed 800 people for 300 days, or 8,000 people for 30 days. And this was one ship, one routine supply delivery. Not special, not emergency, just regular logistics. The supervisor mentioned that supply ships arrived every 2 weeks. Roughly 26 ships per year to this facility alone, which meant over 12,000 tons of food annually, just for this one small camp and its associated military operations. Multiply that across the entire Pacific Theater, hundreds of facilities, thousands of ships, millions of tons of supplies moving continuously. The logistics network was so vast that Tanaka couldn't comprehend the full scale. He asked the supervisor how many supply ships Japan had. The supervisor didn't know. Guessed maybe Japan had dozens of supply ships before the war started, but most had been sunk by submarines. American submarines were very effective at disrupting Japanese supply lines, which explained why Japanese soldiers starved. Ships carrying food were being sunk. Food wasn't reaching troops. Logistics had failed catastrophically. But American logistics continued functioning because they had enough ships that losses didn't break the system. Enough redundancy that disruption couldn't cause collapse. That evening, Tanaka sat with Yamada and described what he'd seen. The cargo ship, the 480 tons of food, the continuous supply network. Yamada was quiet for a long time. Then he said something that seemed to summarize everything. They weren't defeated by better soldiers. They were defeated by better supply chains, by farmers and ships and refrigeration technology, by the mundane logistics of moving food from farms to forces. America had mastered that, Japan had not, and wars are won by whoever can keep their soldiers fed. In the camp, there was another prisoner who stood apart from the rest. Lieutenant Nakamura, former logistics officer, career military. He'd been captured at Guam and had been in the camp for 9 months. Nakamura had been silent for most of his captivity, keeping to himself, speaking rarely. Other prisoners assumed he was traumatized or depressed. But one evening, Nakamura approached Tanaka and Yamada. He told them he needed to say something he'd been thinking about for months. He'd been a logistics officer in the Imperial Army. His job was planning supply deliveries, calculating requirements, coordinating shipments. He'd known before the war started that Japan couldn't sustain prolonged operations. The numbers didn't work. Production capacity was too limited. Transportation infrastructure inadequate. He'd reported this to his superiors multiple times, provided calculations showing the problems, recommended against expanding military operations until logistics could be improved. His reports were filed and ignored. Nakamura continued. The leadership had known that soldiers would starve, known that supplies couldn't reach forces, known that the logistics would fail. But they'd proceeded anyway, sent men to fight in conditions where defeat was inevitable because proper support was impossible. He said he'd been eating American food for 9 months, gaining weight, recovering health, and every meal felt like an accusation because he'd known this was possible, known that proper logistics could feed soldiers adequately. But his own military had chosen not to implement systems that worked, had chosen to prioritize other things over soldier welfare. Yamada asked why Nakamura was telling them this now. Nakamura said because they needed to understand. When they returned to Japan, people would ask what happened, why they lost. The easy answer was that America had more weapons, more ships, more planes, but the real answer was logistics, food, the ability to keep soldiers functioning. America had it. Japan didn't. And that made all the military differences inevitable. He said one more thing. He'd spent his career in logistics and had believed proper supply chains were the foundation of military power. But he'd been in a military that didn't share that belief, didn't prioritize logistics, didn't invest in supply infrastructure, and now he understood that beliefs don't matter. Results matter. America's logistics worked. Japan's didn't. Everything else was commentary. The conversation affected Tanaka deeply. Because Nakamura was right. The war wasn't about courage or tactics. It was about keeping people fed. And the side that could feed their forces had won. The side that couldn't feed their forces had lost. Simple, brutal, true. In December 1944, the daily meet continued. Every day, without interruption, without shortage. Tanaka stopped thinking about it consciously. It became routine, normal, which was perhaps the strangest transformation of all. That something impossible by Japanese standards became mundane by American standards. August 1945. The war ended. Atomic bombs, surrender, Japan capitulated. The news reached the camp through official channels. Tanaka felt relief. The dying had stopped, but also dread. What came next? Returning to a nation that couldn't feed its people. Returning to scarcity after months of abundance. Repatriation processing began in October. Tanaka was scheduled for transport in November. On his last day in the camp, he ate his final American meal. Rice, vegetables, meat. He ate slowly, knowing this would be his last adequate meal for a long time. The voyage home took 2 weeks. During that time, Tanaka thought about everything he'd learned, about food and logistics and the economic foundations of military power, about how wars are won by farmers as much as by soldiers. Japan appeared on the horizon in December 1945. The coastline was devastated. Cities were ruins. The nation was broken. Tanaka disembarked at Yokohama and walked through destruction. Everything was rubble, infrastructure gone, people starving in the streets. The nation that had challenged America couldn't even feed its surviving population. He reached his hometown after a week of travel. His family's house was partially standing. His mother and sister had survived, His father and brother were dead. They had almost no food. That first meal home was thin soup, watery, almost no substance. His mother apologized for the poor quality. This was all they had. This was what everyone had. Tanaka looked at the soup and said nothing. What could he say? That he'd been eating better as an enemy prisoner than his family was eating as Japanese citizens? That America had fed him adequately while Japan couldn't feed its own people? The months after return were difficult. Food was scarce, rationing severe. People were dying from malnutrition and disease. The occupation forces brought some supplies, but not enough. Never enough. Tanaka found work where he could, rebuilt his family's house, helped his mother and sister survive, and thought about food constantly, about abundance he'd experienced and scarcity he was living. In 1947, something changed. Tanaka made a decision. He used his savings to lease a small shop, taught himself to cook, opened a modest restaurant. Nothing fancy, just simple food. But one thing made it unusual. He served meat every day, not large portions. He couldn't afford that. But every dish included some meat, a few pieces of pork in the rice, a small portion of beef in the soup, enough to provide protein, enough to show that meat didn't have to be luxury. Other business owners thought he was crazy. Meat was expensive, scarce. Serving it daily would bankrupt him. But Tanaka had learned something in that POW camp. Adequate nutrition matters. Protein matters. Meat matters not as luxury, but as necessity. His restaurant was small, 15 seats, simple menu. But people came, especially former soldiers. They recognized what he was doing, recognized the deliberate choice to serve meat daily. Some asked him where he'd learned this approach. He told them about capture, about the camp, about eating meat daily as a prisoner, about learning that adequate food wasn't luxury. It was strategy. It was the foundation of everything else. Some customers were shocked, some uncomfortable, but many understood. They'd experienced similar realizations, similar contrasts between Japanese scarcity and American abundance, similar recognition that food production was strategic capability. By 1950, Tanaka's restaurant was successful enough that he could expand, hire staff, serve more customers. And always, every single day, every dish included meat. He married in 1952, had children, built a life around food, teaching through food, showing through daily practice that abundance was possible, that serving meat daily wasn't wasteful luxury, but sensible nutrition. His children grew up helping in the restaurant, learning to cook, learning that meat was normal. They didn't understand why their father was so insistent about this until they were older, and he explained about the war, about capture, about eating meat daily as a prisoner while Japanese soldiers starved, about understanding that America had won not through better weapons, but through better farms, better logistics, better food production. His son asked once why he'd opened a restaurant instead of becoming a farmer if food production mattered so much. Tanaka explained that Japan needed both, needed farmers to produce food, but also needed people to demonstrate that adequate nutrition was achievable. That meat daily wasn't an impossible dream, but practical goal. His restaurant was his way of teaching that lesson. The years passed. Japan recovered, became prosperous, food abundance increased. By the 1970s, meat consumption in Japan had increased dramatically. No longer rare luxury, standard part of diet. People ate meat regularly without thinking about it, which meant Tanaka's restaurant was no longer unusual. Serving meat daily was normal for many establishments. His original purpose had been achieved. The lesson had been learned. Abundance had become ordinary, but he kept the restaurant open, kept serving meat daily, because the lesson wasn't just about abundance. It was about remembering when meat was impossible, remembering what that scarcity had meant, remembering why Japan had lost. In 1985, an American tourist visited his restaurant. Older man, former military. He complimented the food and asked through a translator how long Tanaka had been serving meat daily. Tanaka told him, 40 years, since 1947. every single day. The American asked why. Tanaka explained briefly about being a POW, about eating meat daily in the camp, about learning that abundance was strategic capability. The American was quiet for a moment. Then he said something. He'd been a cook in the Pacific, had served food to prisoners, had wondered sometimes if the prisoners understood. If they recognized what the food represented. Tanaka confirmed they'd understood, that some prisoners had understood immediately. Others took time, but eventually, everyone recognized what American food abundance meant about the war, about economic power, about industrial capacity. The American nodded, said he was glad the lesson hadn't been wasted, paid for his meal. Left, Tanaka stood in his restaurant after the American left and thought about that conversation, about lessons learned and remembered, about a 40-year commitment to teaching through food. His restaurant became a quiet landmark, not famous, not celebrated in guidebooks, but known to veterans, to people who understood the significance, to those who recognized what daily meat represented. Yoshiro Tanaka died in 2002 at age 79. His son took over the restaurant, kept serving meat daily, kept the tradition, kept the lesson alive. The restaurant still operates today, small, modest, unremarkable to most people, but to those who know the story, it represents something important. A lesson learned in 1944, a truth recognized through metal trays and portions of meat, an understanding that wars are won by logistics and lost by starvation. America fed its prisoners better than Japan fed its soldiers. That asymmetry explained everything. And one man spent 60 years teaching that lesson through a simple restaurant that served meat every single day. Not because meat is special, but because it represents what matters. Production, distribution, the mundane logistics of keeping people fed, the foundations of power that military academies don't teach, but prisoners of war learn.